The stale air in my apartment clung to me like a cheap suit. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight that dared to pierce the perpetual gloom, illuminating the stacks of unopened mail and the faint outline of a life I'd long since abandoned. It had been 3 years since the firm had shown me the door, 3 years since my name had become synonymous with cautionary tale in the hushed corridors of finance. Now, I mostly dealt with the quiet hum of my own disappointment, the clatter of my keyboard a solitary soundtrack to my self-imposed exile. My phone, a relic from a time when it actually rang with meaningful calls, buzzed with an insistent, unfamiliar tone. I ignored it at first, letting it vibrate against the worn wood of my desk. But it persisted, a digital mosquito I couldn't swat away. With a sigh, I picked it up, squinting at the unknown number. "Seth," I grunted, my voice raspy from disuse. A hesitant voice, laced with an unmistakable tremor, replied, "Seth, it's the precinct, Detective Miller." My gut tightened. Police. That never meant good news, especially not for someone like me who'd spent his career untangling the financial knots of less-than-savory characters. "What's this about?" "We're at the old Sterling building," Detective Miller said, her voice tight. We found a body. We think it might be someone I knew, Mark Jenkins." The name hit me like a physical. Mark, my former colleague, the one with the perpetually rumpled shirt and the unnerving ability to spot a fraudulent entry from a mile away. We'd been rivals, sure, but there was a grudging respect between us. And more than that, a shared history of late nights and caffeine-fueled breakthroughs. "Mark," I repeated, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. "Is he?" "He's dead, Seth. Blunt force trauma, nasty business." Detective Miller paused. "The thing is, there's a lot of financial paperwork around him. Complex stuff. We were hoping I might be able to shed some light." My mind raced, a familiar, unwelcome energy stirring within me. Disgraced or not, the thrill of a puzzle, a financial labyrinth, was hardwired into my DNA. "Where are I?" The address she gave me was in a part of town I deliberately erased from my mental map, a place where shadows clung to buildings like grime. Asterisk, asterisk. The air in the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker was thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else. Something heavier, more final. The single fluorescent light overhead buzzed erratically, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed with each flicker. It was a place designed to strip away dignity, to reduce life to a clinical examination. Detective Miller, a woman whose sharp eyes seemed to miss nothing, stood beside a stainless steel table. Her face was grim, etched with the weariness of someone who'd seen too much. On the table, covered by a sheet, lay the still form of Mark Jenkins. "This is where we found him," she said, her voice low. "Right here." My gaze swept the room. I could feel the clamminess of the concrete floor seeping through my worn loafers. "He was working on something," Detective Miller continued, gesturing to a scattered pile of documents on a nearby trolley. A mess of spreadsheets, ledgers, what looked like offshore account statements. All coded. We can't make heads or tails of it. I stepped closer, my heart a dull thud against my ribs. The spreadsheets were indeed a labyrinth of numbers and symbols, far beyond the scope of a typical financial report. This wasn't just accounting, this was cryptography. Mark, my meticulous, often frustratingly precise former colleague, had been deep in something dangerous enough to get him killed. "He always did like a challenge," I murmured, my eyes scanning the intricate patterns of the data. It was a language I understood even if it was disguised. The numbers themselves, the sequences, the peculiar spacing, it all pointed to a deliberate obfuscation. Detective Miller watched me, her expression unreadable. "You recognize this?" I picked up a thick ledger, its cover worn smooth with age. Inside, Mark's familiar, spidery handwriting filled the pages, but interspersed with it were strange notations, a series of symbols I'd only ever seen in abstract mathematical texts. "It's encrypted," I said, my voice gaining a familiar edge. The old Seth, the one who'd relished peeling back layers of deception, was starting to surface. He was hiding something big. My eyes fell on a small, leather-bound notebook tucked beneath a stack of papers. It looked out of place, too personal for this sterile environment. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cool, smooth leather. Inside, more coded entries, but this time interspersed with dates and what looked like brief, cryptic phrases. I flipped through the notebook, my mind already piecing together fragments, searching for a pattern, a connection. "I don't know yet," I admitted, the weight of the task settling on my shoulders. But whatever it was enough to get him killed. The air in the basement morgue, pipes dripping. Fluorescent flicker was thick with a smell I hadn't encountered in years, that acrid metallic tang that clung to everything. It wasn't just the disinfectant. It was something deeper, something that settled in your lungs and made you want to hold your breath. I'd tried to leave that life behind, the spreadsheets and the hidden ledgers, the whispers of malfeasance. But here I was, standing over a body, a former colleague. He lay on the cold steel slab, unnervingly still. The attending official, a stern woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense haircut, gestured vaguely. "Anything strike eye, Mr. Seth?" I surveyed the scene, my gaze sweeping over the sterile white tiles, the rows of gleaming instruments, the inevitable stainless steel drawers. My eyes snagged on the notebook again, still open on the table beside me. The coded entries were a familiar language, a twisted dialect of numbers and symbols I'd once spoken fluently. This wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. This was deliberate. The transactions, I began, my voice rougher than I expected. They're not random. They're layered, sophisticated. I pointed to a specific entry in the notebook, a string of figures and what looked like Roman numerals. This isn't just accounting. This is a message. The attending official leaned closer, her expression unreadable. A message for whom? That, I said, my mind already racing, piecing together fragments of old cases, of hushed rumors I dismissed as paranoia, is what we need to find out. The intellectual itch long dormant began to stir. It was a dangerous feeling, a siren song that had led me to ruin once before, but looking at my former colleague, at the life brutally extinguished, guilt warred with that familiar thrill. He was working on something big. I murmured, more to myself than to the official, something that made him a target. I remembered late nights, hushed phone calls, the nervous energy that had always surrounded him when he was on the verge of a breakthrough. He'd always been a bit of a gambler, not with cards, but with information, pushing boundaries, digging where others wouldn't dare. The official watched me, her gaze steady. I knew him well. We worked together years ago before my own troubles. I didn't elaborate. The details of my professional downfall were a scar I preferred to keep hidden. He was sharp, too sharp. Sometimes, I picked up the notebook, the worn leather cool against my fingertips. The coded entries weren't just numbers, they were a puzzle, an intricate tapestry woven with financial data. Dates, amounts, cryptic abbreviations, but this was more intricate, more deeply buried. This isn't just about money, I said, tracing a series of numbers with my finger. This is about influence, power. My mind flashed back to a conversation I'd had with my former colleague, a casual mention of a powerful syndicate that operated far beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement. I'd brushed it off then, but now, the attending official finally offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We're hitting a wall, Mr. Seth. The digital trails are scrubbed clean. No witnesses, no obvious motive beyond the superficial." She paused, her eyes flicking back to the notebook in my hand. My expertise. It might be the only way to decipher this. It felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was it, the precipice. Stepping back into this world meant confronting everything I'd tried to escape. It meant risking exposure, inviting the kind of scrutiny that had already cost me my career. But my former colleague, he deserved justice. And the sheer audacity of the crime, the intricate web of deception, was a challenge I couldn't ignore. "I'll help," I said, the words tasting like dust and regret. "But I need access. Full access, to his files, his accounts, anything related to this." I met the official's gaze, my own resolve hardening, and I need to know who else knew he was looking into this. She gave me a curt nod. "I'll have it. My name is the detective. I can reach me through my precinct. Don't waste my time, mister." I opened the notebook again, the coded entries swimming before my eyes. The game was on. And this time I had a feeling the stakes were higher than I could possibly imagine. The faint scent of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and grim, filled the air. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. This was more than a murder, it was a declaration, and I was about to answer it. The detective had left me with more questions than answers, a familiar ache settling behind my eyes. I looked down at the notebook again, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to its pages. The detective's dismissive tone still buzzed in my ears, but the urgency in Mark's scrawled notes, even in their coded form, was a siren song I couldn't ignore. This wasn't just some random act. Mark wouldn't have been here in this sterile, echoing place if it wasn't important. The basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker. The words themselves felt heavy, wrong. It was a stark contrast to the usual sterile, yet functional offices where Mark, and I had spent countless hours dissecting balance sheets and chasing phantom invoices. Here, the air was thick with a metallic tang, and the low hum of the lights felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. Each drip from the unseen pipes punctuated the silence, a morbid countdown. I traced a finger over the first coded entry. It looked like a string of alphanumeric characters, utterly meaningless to anyone outside our specialized world. But I knew Mark. He was meticulous almost to a fault. If he'd gone to this much trouble, if he'd ended up here. There had to be a reason. My gaze drifted to the stainless steel table in the center of the room. A faint, almost imperceptible smudge marred its surface. I leaned closer, my breath misting the cool metal. It looked like ink, a very specific shade of blue, the kind used in high-end fountain pens. Mark had a penchant for those. He always said they were a sign of precision, of intent. I filed the observation away, a tiny knot of unease tightening in my gut. I returned to the notebook, my focus sharpening. The first few lines were a jumble, but then a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just random characters. It was a substitution cipher, a playful, albeit grim, puzzle Mark had often used in our internal communications to bypass the less-than-secure company email. He'd called it his secret handshake. Alpha 7 Delta 9 Omega, transaction ID 4B7F, amount 10,000. My mind immediately started cross-referencing. Alpha 7 Delta 9 Omega. It wasn't a standard account number. It was too short, too abstract. But in Mark's system, certain letter-number combinations represented specific entities. I remembered a project we'd worked on years ago, a sensitive audit for a holding company with an intentionally opaque structure. They'd used a similar internal code for their subsidiaries. Could this be related? I pulled out my phone, the screen's brightness jarring in the dim light. I had a backup drive at my apartment, loaded with old project files, including the codebooks Mark and I had developed. A shiver, unrelated to the temperature, ran down my spine. This was more than just a puzzle. It felt like a breadcrumb trail left specifically for me. Gamma 2 Echo 6 Psi, transaction ID 9A1C, amount 50,000. The amounts were significant, but not astronomically so, not at first glance. The real kicker was the transaction ID. They were always 4 characters long, a mix of letters and numbers. I'd seen that format before. It was the default ID generated by a specific accounting software, a proprietary system used by a very small, very exclusive group of offshore financial institutions. Mark had once complained about its archaic interface, but admitted its security features were robust. A wave of cold dread washed over me. This wasn't just about Mark's personal finances. He was digging into something big, something that involved these obscure entities and this particular accounting software. I flipped further into the notebook. The entries became more frequent, the coded language more complex. Mark had even started incorporating dates, but they were encoded too, a series of seemingly random numbers that, with a bit of effort, I could decipher. Delta 4 Bravo 1 Kappa, transaction ID 2D8E, date 03-11-2023, amount 250,000. The amounts were escalating, and the dates, they were recent. Very recent. This wasn't some historical anomaly he was investigating. He was actively tracking money moving now. I had focused on the more straightforward fraud cases. I'd been the pragmatist. My phone buzzed, a text from a colleague. "Hey, Seth, heard you were poking around Mark's office. Be careful, man. Some people don't like that kind of attention." The message was vague, deliberately so, but it confirmed my growing suspicion. This wasn't just a random act of violence, and now I was following in his footsteps. I looked back at the notebook, the ink smudge on the table, the coded entries, the specific software. Mark hadn't just been an accountant. He'd been a detective, using his unique skills to uncover a financial conspiracy that was likely far larger and more sinister than anyone imagined. And his last act was to leave me a map. The detective had said they had no leads. They were treating it as a robbery gone wrong. They were wrong. This was about the numbers, about the hidden transactions, about the people who wanted them to stay hidden. And I was the only one who could see the pattern. The weight of that knowledge settled on my shoulders, heavy and suffocating, as the pipes continued their relentless, rhythmic drip. The air in the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker was thick, cloying. It clung to me like a second skin, the metallic tang of old blood a constant, unwelcome perfume. I'd been down here for hours, hunched over Mark's meager effects, the faint hum of the ancient refrigeration units a monotonous counterpoint to the frantic beat of my own thoughts. The notebook lay open, its pages filled with Mark's spidery script, a testament to his meticulous, almost obsessive nature. I traced the ink smudge on the table again, the faint T it formed. It was a ghost of a clue, barely there, but it was all I had. I'd gone through the ledger Mark had left behind, the one with the innocuous-looking entries that screamed foul play to my trained eye. Offshore accounts, shell corporations nestled in tax havens like barnacles on a ship's hull, transactions that defied logic, routed through a labyrinth of holding companies. Mark had been trying to untangle it, and it had cost him everything. My gaze drifted to a small, tarnished silver locket I'd found tucked into the lining of his worn satchel. It was uncharacteristic for Mark, who wasn't one for sentimentality. Inside, instead of a photograph, was a tiny, folded piece of paper. My fingers, stiff from the cold, fumbled with it. Unfolding, it revealed a string of numbers, a sequence that looked almost random. But Mark didn't do random. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over the contacts. Who could I even talk to about this? The official channels were a dead end, or worse, compromised. My old firm, they'd probably sell me out for a discount on their liability insurance. No, this had to be on me, the numbers. I stared at them, my mind racing through every encoding system I'd ever encountered. Not a simple cipher, too complex for that, it felt. Financial, a Bloomberg ticker, a stock price history. I started typing them into a financial data aggregator. My brow furrowed in concentration. Nothing. No recognizable symbol, no date format that made sense. Then it hit me. Not a sequence of numbers representing something, but a key to unlock something. Mark had mentioned a particular analyst at a rival firm, someone he'd clashed with years ago, a real bulldog named Thorne. Thorne was known for his eccentricities, his almost pathological obsession with patterns. Could Mark have been trying to communicate with him? Or more likely, had Thorne been involved? The tea from the smudge. Thorne, I felt a prickle of unease. Thorne was brilliant, no doubt, but also ruthless. If he was involved in this, it was a whole new level of danger. I continued digging, cross-referencing the shell corporations with known associates of Thorne's. It was like pulling threads from a rotten tapestry. Each one I tugged revealed more decay. One name kept surfacing. A holding company registered in the Cayman Islands, listed as a primary investor in several of Thorne's more speculative ventures. The name itself was innocuous, almost bland, Apex Holdings, but the directors, that's where it got interesting. One of them was a name I recognized from a different context, a former associate of a powerful politician, a man known for his discretion and his alleged ability to make problems disappear. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about influence, about power. My phone buzzed, making me jump. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, I answered. Seth. The voice was low, gravelly, and completely unfamiliar. My hand tightened on the phone. Who is this? Someone who knows I read looking into Mark's unfortunate situation. A pause, heavy with unspoken threat. I read digging in places I shouldn't, Seth, places that are very deep and very dark. My blood ran cold, not from fear, but from a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the direct threat. They knew I was here, they knew what I was doing. Who are I? I repeated, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. Let's just say I'm an interested party. Mark was a problem, I read becoming one. The voice chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Apex Holdings is a very strong company, Seth. It has deep roots. I try to pull them up. I might find myself buried underneath. The line went dead. They'd made contact. They'd issued a warning. This wasn't just about uncovering a financial crime. It was about survival. Mark hadn't just been investigating numbers. He'd been poking a bear, a very large, very dangerous bear. And now the bear knew I was here. The tea on the table, Thorne, Apex Holdings, the politician's associate. It was all starting to form a terrifying picture, and I was standing right in the middle of it. I looked down at the locket, the numbers on the tiny paper still a puzzle. But now the stakes were infinitely higher than solving a cipher. They were about staying alive. The line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, the silence in the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker suddenly deafening. The metallic tang of the air seemed sharper, the shadows deeper. This wasn't just about uncovering a financial. What? A financial crime. It felt much bigger than that, and the chilling implication of that cutoff call settled in my gut like a cold stone. I moved back to Mark's desk, the scent of stale coffee and something vaguely antiseptic clinging to the air. The scattered papers, the half-finished spreadsheet, the grim evidence of his final hours, it all felt like a taunt now. The anonymous caller hadn't just confirmed my suspicions. They'd validated the fear that had been a low hum beneath my professional detachment since I'd first seen Mark's name on the initial report. My eyes landed on a small, framed photograph tucked beneath a stack of invoices. It was Mark, younger, beaming, his arms slung around a woman with kind eyes and a bright smile. A family photo. I'd never known Mark to be married, never heard him mention a partner or kids. He was always the solitary accountant, buried in ledgers and tax codes. This woman, though, there was a familiarity I couldn't quite place. I picked up the frame, my fingers tracing the edge. The woman's name was printed on a small plaque beneath the photo, Eleanor Vance. Vance. The name snagged in my memory, a loose thread from a case I'd worked years ago, a case that had nearly ruined me. It involved a shell corporation, a series of offshore accounts, and a missing sum of money that had vanished into thin air. And Vance. Vance had been listed as a potential beneficiary in some of the preliminary documents, a name that had been quickly buried and dismissed by the authorities at the time. My breath hitched. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a direct link. The cryptic transactions, the anonymous warning, and now Alina Vance, the woman in Mark's photo, connected to a ghost from my past. The scale of this thing was expanding exponentially, morphing from a complex financial fraud into something far more personal, far more dangerous. I returned to the computer, my hands still trembling slightly, the coded transactions. I'd been treating them as abstract data points, numbers on a screen. Now I saw them differently. They weren't just entries in a ledger, they were breadcrumbs leading not just to illicit funds, but to people, to relationships, to lives. I pulled up the latest batch of transactions I downloaded from the secure server. The sequence of alphanumeric codes that had seemed so random earlier now felt loaded with a new significance. I started cross-referencing them with known aliases and offshore entities associated with the architect's old network. It was like piecing together a puzzle where the pieces kept shifting. But this time, I had a clearer picture of the final image. One particular string of numbers kept reappearing, a recurring identifier tied to a series of surprisingly small, frequent transfers. It wasn't the kind of money the architect would typically deal with. Too petty, too domestic. I dug deeper, tracing the flow of these smaller transactions. They weren't moving through the usual labyrinth of shell companies. Instead, they were being routed through a series of surprisingly legitimate-looking foundations and charities. My mind raced. Was this some kind of elaborate money laundering scheme for a personal slush fund? Or was it something else? I scrolled through the details of one of these foundations. Its stated purpose was to support arts education for underprivileged children. The listed board members were all respectable figures, but one name, a patron of the arts who had contributed a significant amount of personal wealth, caught my eye. A name that had also appeared in the periphery of the architect's original network, albeit in a much more tangential way. A name that, when I looked closely at the signature on a scanned donation receipt, bore a striking resemblance to the handwriting in the margin of one of Mark's own personal notebooks. My stomach twisted. Mark wasn't just investigating a financial crime. He was entangled in something that had infiltrated his personal life. The woman in the photograph, Alina Vance, was the key. And if Vance was connected to the architect and Mark was connected to Vance, then Mark had been walking into a trap. I leaned back, the worn fabric of the chair creaking beneath me. The air in the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker, seemed to hum with an unseen energy. The warning call, the photograph, the intertwined financial trails, it was all converging. This wasn't just about recovering stolen money anymore. It was about understanding how deeply this rot had spread and who else might be caught in its grasp. I had to find Alina Vance. The click of the receiver echoed in the cavernous space of the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker casting long, dancing shadows. The metallic tang of the air, usually a dull hum of disinfectant and decay, felt charged now, electric. They knew I was digging. They knew I was close. A warning. Not a threat, not yet, but a clear signal to back off. Back off, not a chance. Not after what happened to my colleague, not when this smelled like something far bigger than a simple embezzlement. This reeked of a system rigged, of numbers twisted and bent to serve a power I couldn't yet comprehend. Vance. The name had been whispered, a ghost in the digital ether, a phantom pulling strings from the shadows. He was the architect of this mess, I was sure of it. And he just let me know he was watching. My fingers traced the worn leather of my briefcase. Inside, a sheaf of printouts, a digital recorder, and a carefully crafted plan. The annual Sterling Gala, ostentatious, exclusive, and the last place I'd ever willingly go. But it was also where Vance was expected to be. If I wanted to find proof, I needed to get close. Getting in was the first hurdle. My name, Seth, was mud in financial circles. The scandal had seen to that. But desperation breeds innovation. And a few well-placed calls, a carefully fabricated invitation, and a significant donation to a dubious charity had opened a door. A very small, very guarded door. The night of the gala arrived like a thunderclap. The city skyline glittered outside my rented car window, a dazzling tapestry of ambition and excess. I adjusted the knot of my borrowed tie, the silk feeling foreign against my skin. I looked like a man who'd seen too much, and that, I supposed, was exactly the impression I needed to make. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Tower was a symphony of clinking champagne flutes, hushed conversations, and the soaring notes of a live orchestra. Every face was a mask, every smile a carefully constructed facade. I felt like an imposter, a rat in a palace of silk and gold. I moved through the throng, my gaze sweeping over the attendees. Politicians, titans of industry, media moguls, the usual suspects. I spotted the security detail, their earpieces a subtle tell, their eyes constantly scanning. Vance wouldn't be here without a retinue. My objective wasn't to confront him, not yet. It was to observe, to listen, to find a crack in his armor. The coded transactions my colleague had left behind were a puzzle, and I suspected the key lay not in the numbers themselves, but in the people who moved them. I found a vantage point near a towering floral arrangement, pretending to admire the lilies while my ears strained to catch snippets of conversation. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and desperation. "The offshore accounts are holding steady," a voice murmured, laced with an almost imperceptible tremor. I recognized the speaker, a senior partner at a prominent investment firm, a man whose public image was one of unimpeachable integrity. Now his words painted a different picture. "And the acquisitions?" Another voice, deeper, smoother, replied. "Proceeding as planned, the market is ripe for consolidation." Consolidation, that was a polite word for it. My colleague's notes had alluded to a systematic dismantling of smaller entities, a quiet absorption that left no trace. It was a financial strangulation, executed with surgical precision. My heart gave a jolt. Across the room, a man with silver hair and a predatory smile was holding court. He was exactly as I'd pictured him: sharp suit, eyes that missed nothing, a charisma that could charm the devil himself. He was surrounded, a king on his throne, but his gaze swept the room, and for a fleeting moment it met mine. A flicker, recognition, or just the casual sweep of a man used to being watched. I forced myself to look away, to break eye contact, my palms slick with sweat. He'd noticed me. The warning was more direct than I'd anticipated. I needed to move to find something tangible, something that couldn't be explained away by the usual machinations of the ultra-rich. I drifted towards a quieter alcove, where a small group was gathered around a display of antique maps. It was a distraction, a deliberate piece of artifice. But sometimes the most important truths hid in plain sight, disguised as something else entirely. A woman with eyes like chips of ice excused herself from the group and headed towards a private study, the door marked with a discreet brass plaque, "Private Collection." Vance's movements were subtle, but I'd been watching him. He followed her not directly, but with a calculated delay. This was it. The chance. My colleague's final ledger, the one that had been missing, the one that might hold the key to everything, had been rumored to be in Vance's possession. And if he was meeting someone in private. I waited until the hallway was momentarily clear, then slipped through the study door, leaving it ajar just enough to hear. The hushed tones within were barely audible, but the tension was palpable. I strained to listen, my breath catching in my throat. All loose ends will be tied. Loose ends? My colleague was a loose end. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Then Vance's voice, a low rumble that nevertheless carried an unnerving authority. "And the accounting, are we certain it's clean?" "Impeccable as always," the woman replied. "The phantom entries are indistinguishable from legitimate transactions. No one will ever find them." Phantom entries, that was it. The coded transactions weren't a code to be broken, but a phantom limb, a ghostly presence designed to vanish. My colleague hadn't been trying to decode them, he'd been trying to reveal them. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned, my hand instinctively reaching for the small, heavy object in my inner jacket pocket. It wasn't a weapon, not really, but it would do. The game had just escalated, and I was no longer just an observer. I was a participant, and Vance was about to learn that some phantom entries could bite back. The chill in the basement morgue, pipes dripping, fluorescent flicker was a damp, stale thing clinging to my skin like a shroud. It wasn't the cold that tightened my chest, though. It was the sudden, sharp understanding. Phantom entries. My colleague hadn't been trying to crack a code, he'd been trying to make the invisible visible. The way a surgeon might probe for a tumor, he'd been tracing the ghost of money that was never meant to be found. I didn't jump. My focus was too locked on the spreadsheet still glowing on my laptop screen, a tapestry of falsified numbers and vanishing assets. The creak was just another sound in this symphony of decay. I turned, slowly. Vance stood there, silhouetted against the weak light spilling from the hallway. He looked tired. The usual sharp edges of his suit seemed softened, the creases less defined. But his eyes, even in the dimness, were sharp, assessing. He held a small, tarnished silver flask. "Still digging, Seth?" His voice was low, a gravelly murmur that seemed to absorb the ambient drips. I left a mess. He took a slow sip from the flask, the liquid glinting. "A mess?" I thought I was being thorough. A faint smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Thorough doesn't involve making my own colleague disappear, I replied, my voice even. I watched him closely, looking for any flicker, any tell. He was good, too good. Years of working together had taught me that much. He was getting too close, Vance answered, his gaze drifting to the rows of covered gurneys lining the walls. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. He was asking the wrong questions, asking them of the wrong people. And I answered them myself, I suppose. I gestured to my laptop. These phantom entries, Vance, they're not a code, they're a misdirection, but I got sloppy. I left a trail, just not the one I intended. He took another sip from his flask. Sloppy or deliberate. Sometimes, Seth, the best way to hide something is to make it look like a mistake, a sign of my own incompetence. People stop looking when they think they've found the answer, even if it's the wrong one. My mind raced. He was right. If the transactions were designed to look like errors, like a beginner's fumble, then anyone trying to break them would be looking for a pattern, a cipher. Vance shrugged, the movement barely perceptible. He was a liability, and I am becoming one too. He pushed himself off the wall, taking a step towards me. This is millions, Vance, maybe billions, and sometimes the greater good requires sacrifices. He reached inside his jacket. My hand instinctively moved towards my own, even though I knew I was unarmed. Vance pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. It was old, the kind I might find in a dusty archive, not a place like this. This, he responded, holding it up, is the real ledger, the one that matters, the one that proves what I've done and why. And you expect me to just believe you? I scoffed. The air felt heavy, charged. The dripping pipes seemed to echo the frantic beat of my own pulse. You don't have to believe me, Vance added, his eyes locking onto mine. You just have to understand the world isn't as black and white as you like to think. Sometimes to fight monsters, you have to become one. He placed the ledger on the autopsy table between us. The money, it's not just money, it's influence, it's control, and it's being used to stabilize things to prevent far worse from happening. I stared at the ledger, then back at Vance. Was he telling the truth? Was this some elaborate, twisted justification for murder and massive fraud? Or was he truly trying to convince me that the ends justified the means? The lines blurred, and for a terrifying moment I felt the ground shift beneath me. A faint click echoed from the hallway, the sound of a lock engaging. My breath hitched. The people who are coming for this ledger, Vance replied, his voice now urgent, they don't care about justice, they care about power, and they won't stop at anything to get it. He looked back at me, his expression grim. And they won't leave anyone alive who knows about it. The fluorescent light above us flickered violently. The dripping of the pipes seemed to intensify, each drop a ticking clock. I was trapped, with Vance, and with whatever was coming. The silence after the scream was heavier than the darkness. It pressed in, thick and suffocating, broken only by the insistent, rhythmic drip, drip, drip from the unseen pipes. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the sudden void. The fluorescent flicker had been the last straw, a theatrical flourish in a scene already playing out like a nightmare. Now, just the faint blue-white glow of my laptop screen illuminating the grim tableau before me. The glint of metal I'd seen earlier was still clutched in his hand, a letter opener, of all things. Pathetic. But whoever had been here before me, whoever Vance had been meeting, had been far more efficient and far less sentimental. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragmented moments leading up to this. The coded ledger, the hushed conversations I'd overheard in the stairwell, Vance's increasingly erratic behavior. It all pointed to something big, something far beyond the petty embezzlement he'd initially confessed to. This was deeper. This was systemic. I cautiously approached Vance's body, my worn leather shoes squeaking on the damp floor. The smell of antiseptic and something metallic, something undeniably death asterisk, filled my nostrils. I knelt beside him, my eyes scanning the scene. No sign of forced entry. Whoever it was, Vance had let them in, or they'd had a key. My gaze fell on the ledger I'd dropped earlier. It lay open, its pages a chaotic mess of numbers and symbols. This was the heart of it, I knew, the key to unlocking the entire operation. But it was still a puzzle, a complex cipher designed to keep outsiders out. And now Vance was dead, taking his knowledge with him, or was he? A flicker of movement caught my eye. Near Vance's outstretched hand, half hidden by his slumped form, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It looked out of place, almost sentimental amidst the brutal reality of the basement morgue, pipes dripping their mournful tune. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. It sprang open easily, revealing two tiny, faded photographs. One was of Vance, younger, smiling. The other was a woman I didn't recognize. Her eyes, though blurred by age, held a spark of intelligence, a knowing glint that reminded me uncomfortably of myself. and etched into the inside of the locket, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a single, elegant initial. E.E. The name echoed in my mind, Eleanor. The analyst Vance had been so obsessed with, the one who'd supposedly quit years ago. Had she been involved? Was this her locket? My mind reeled. Vance wasn't just a pawn. He was tangled up in something far more personal than I'd imagined. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, and perhaps about revenge. I stood up. The locket clutched tight in my palm. I had to finish this. For Vance, for Eleanor, for the truth. I spread the ledger out, the locket resting beside it. The numbers swam before my eyes, but now with the image of Eleanor's face in my mind, with the initial E as a guide, a new pattern began to emerge. It wasn't a simple cipher. It was layered, intricate, designed to be unreadable by anyone without an intimate understanding of Vance's personal life, his obsessions, his hidden connections. The initial E wasn't just a name, it was a key, a password. I began to cross-reference the coded entries with dates and events Vance had mentioned, piecing together a timeline. Eleanor's name appeared sporadically, not in transactions, but in notations, almost like private journal entries embedded within the financial data. Her supposed departure from the firm coincided with the first major offshore transfers, and the amounts, they were astronomical, enough to destabilize entire markets. It was smaller, more personal, and infinitely more dangerous. It was Vance and Eleanor and a deep-seated betrayal that had festered for years. Vance had been trying to expose it, or perhaps to reclaim what he believed was theirs, and someone had stopped him. My hands trembled as I traced the final entries. A massive withdrawal, scheduled for the next day, routed through a shell corporation I recognized. The same one my former boss, the one who'd driven me out of the firm, had been using. He was involved. Vance hadn't been a victim of some grand conspiracy. He'd been a player, a misguided participant in a scheme born of personal vendetta and greed. And Eleanor, he was the architect. I closed the ledger, the click of the cover echoing in the quiet office. The basement morgue, pipes dripping their relentless dirge, felt a world away. My old life, the one I'd tried so hard to bury, had dragged me back. I picked up the phone, my fingers dialing a number I hadn't called in years. It was time to go to the authorities. Not as the disgraced forensic accountant, but as the man who had finally found the truth, however ugly it might be. The fight wasn't over, but the game had changed, and I was ready to play.